All right. So, we did all of our body fluid balance last time. Today, kidney day. So we're going to start with just organization of the renal system. And this is just in case you wanted to take a look at a physical model instead of just a picture. So we have plenty of figures that are going to show up on the slides, but I will also show you a physical model if you want to come up and take a look as we go through this content. How many people did the questions from last time? Few. Not very many. All right. How about we take a quick second and we will actually go through those very quickly, just so that everybody is on the same page. The effect of, well, I have to unassign them, but the effect of adding 2 liters of 0.9% sodium chloride. First of all, if you have 0.9% sodium chloride, what does that equate to? Hypo, hyper, or isotonic? It's isotonic. Okay, 0.9% solution that is isotonic would be what? What would you expect to see? 1, right? Because you're going to do an infusion. It's going to stay in the extracellular fluid, but it is isotonic, so it's not going to change the osmolarity. The one I really wanted to bring up is the difference between this second question and third question. So the second question was asking the effect of adding 2 liters of 5% glucose. 5% glucose is an isosmotic solution. The second you add that in, what would you expect to see? You see the same thing, right? Because it's still an isosmotic solution. As soon as you add it, it's going into the extracellular solution. But what happens after you're dealing with something that can be metabolized? It can be taken up by the cells and it can be metabolized. What would you see then? Is it now an osmotically active agent the way that it was before? No, because you've broken it down and you've utilized the components. But because it goes into the cell, now you will have more of an appearance like this, where the osmolarity would actually be lower, because the effect is that you are adding 2 liters of solution, but then you're adding something that's metabolized. Okay? So you'll end up with something that appears a little bit more like just adding 2 liters of straight water. The last one was the expectation that you would have by losing water from dehydration. That would be lost from both compartments, and it would increase the concentration of your solutes. So that's just the review from the last time. We didn't have time to get through those last few questions, so I just wanted to run through those very quickly before we get started on all the fun stuff of the renal system. All right, so your kidneys. Your kidneys are about less than 0.5% of your total body weight. You have 2 of them. They look like kidney beans, beans on either side of your body. Each of them is going to have about 1 million nephrons. The nephron is your functional unit, and that's what we're really going to be talking a lot about. The figure that I wanted to show here is the same as what's in here. And let's see if this will show up well. If I can zoom out far enough. Okay, so this is the model of the actual kidney. If I have enough space. Okay, so if you want to come up and take a look afterwards, we're going to talk about the difference in the appearance of this, this cortical layer out here on the outside. It has a more granular appearance because that is where all of your convoluted tubules reside. Your glomeruli are going to reside out there, as well as all of the blood vessels that are going to go alongside the convoluted tubules as well. So it has a more granular appearance, whereas the medulla, so your cortical region outside, has a more granular appearance because of your glomeruli and your convoluted tubules. Your medulla is where your pyramids are going to reside. They have a darker appearance. They have a more linear setup. And it's because of a parallel arrangement between the loop of Henle and your vasa recta. Your vasa recta are your paratubular capillaries that are going to be responsible for the juxtamedullary nephrons. So we're going to talk about two main types of nephrons. This will show how all of these little dots up here, these, I don't know, peach, cream colored dots, these are all of your glomeruli. And from there, you'll have your loop of Henle, and they will connect neighboring loop of Henle into a medullary collecting duct. You'll have an outer medullary collecting duct going into an inner medullary collecting duct, which will dump into your calyces that will go into the renal pelvis and eventually down to the ureter. So when we're looking here, the main parts that we're going to talk about, we're not going to spend as much time talking about micturition and the bladder, because in 503 we talk about the defecation reflex, and they're very similar, where you have two different sphincters that are going to be under that control. So, what is the main function of your kidney in your body? Filtration of what? Your blood. Its whole job is to make sure that your blood volume stays normal and the contents stay normal. Secondary would be excretion of contents. Okay? A lot of people might think that excretion is the primary role. Sort of. It's actually a secondary role in order to accomplish the goal of filtering out the stuff that's not necessary. From your renal pelvis, all of that filtrate that's produced will dump through the ureters, connect down into the bladder, and exit the body through the urethra. This is the 2D image of your kidney. As we said before, the main part to pay attention to up here is when we're looking at the nephron itself. That's the yellow. It shows the circular region is actually your glomerulus. It's always going to be up in the cortical region. Depending on the type of nephron, it could have not just your glomerulus, but most of your proximal and distal convoluted tubules, and a chunk of your loop of Henle could end up residing up in that cortical region. But the glomeruli are always going to be there. Even for your juxtamedullary nephrons, which we'll see in a bit, it's the loop of Henle that's going to be the part that descends deep into the pyramid. The minor calyx is going to connect into the major calyx, which is, these are the names over here. It's just going to connect it into this renal pelvis. The renal pelvis collects all of the filtrate that is produced by every single one of those million nephrons in your kidney. That will send it down to the ureter, and on both sides, hopefully you have two functioning kidneys, both of them will combine in the bladder for storage for later excretion. All right, so we have a few major blood vessels that we're going to talk about. Obviously, we have a renal artery and a renal vein. We talked last time about what you would want to do in order to promote excretion. If you want to get rid of excess fluid, what do you do to blood flow to the renal artery? You increase it, right? We have a unique situation here where we have two sets of arterioles. And these two sets of arterioles are going to be critical in determining the rate at which our glomeruli are going to filter fluid. So we have an afferent arteriole, which is on the bottom there, and then we have that leading into the glomerulus. Your glomerulus is just capillaries. That's all it is. It's called the glomerulus, but they're glomerular capillaries. It's just the capillary bed that's all twisted up inside of Bowman's capsule. Okay? So the afferent arteriole, how many people remember the difference between afferent and efferent? A few people? Okay. Afferent, well, we're talking about the nervous system. Afferent means it's going to the central nervous system. Efferent means it's coming out of the central nervous system. In this case, think of the glomerulus as your CNS of your kidney. An afferent arteriole is going to send blood into the glomerular capillaries. The efferent arteriole is going to take blood from that capillary bed and lead it away into the next capillary bed. We have two capillary beds in series with each other. Okay? After leaving through the efferent arteriole, it will go into the paratubular capillaries. which is actually seen down below, down here. Okay? So far we've talked about our afferent, our glomerulus, and our efferent. So the efferent is right here. Our afferent is going in, and this is your glomerular capillary bed. From there, it will come out through the efferent side and enter into the peritubular capillaries. That is going to service the entire tubular portion of your nephron. Okay? The purpose of having these two capillary beds is because they're going to function in different ways. They're going to work together not just to filter out as much stuff as they can and regulate the amount of fluid and solutes and nutrients and wastes that are going through your blood, but it's also going to make sure that you don't lose too much stuff. You're going to be able to reclaim a lot of it by the processing that happens throughout the tubular portion of the nephron. From that end of that nephron, which we'll talk about the parts in just a second, all of these will have a cortical collecting tubule, which just means it's the collecting tubule is in the cortical region. That's where it's going to reside. You will come down into the medullary region for the loop of Henle, then back up toward the cortical region where all of these will dump into a connecting tubule and then a medullary collecting duct. That medullary collecting duct has an outer portion and an inner portion depending on if you're in the outer region or the inner region. The further you are processing that filtrate, the further in from the medullary collecting duct it goes toward the center of the kidney. Okay, so you're starting with blood entering in through the outside, the cortical region of the kidney, and it's going to process, it's going to take a little bit of a circuitous route down that loop of Henle and then back up toward the cortical region. But eventually, once it's past there and it starts heading back down the collecting duct, it's going into the renal pelvis and eventually leaving. So it's completely processed by this point and should be as concentrated as possible. The concentration will happen in various parts of the loop of Henle, but you actually have a lot of that concentration of urine also happening in the collecting duct, which is something that we'll talk about, I believe, in lecture 20, I think is that content. All right, at the top it says arcuate, arteries, and veins. Arcuate just means bow-shaped curve. It's just a nice little word for it. So it's not anything special, it's just to describe how they are actually shaped. Interlobular is just the ones that are in between each of those pyramids. But you'll notice that the pyramids themselves, the base is going to be in the cortical region of the medulla, and the apex of each of these pyramids is going to be toward the center of the medulla. So this would be your base, and this is your apex. Okay? How do we feel so far about just our basic kidney anatomy? Yes?
So you said the loop of Henle always goes in toward the center of the kidney?
Yeah, so you're always going to have the glomerulus toward the outside in the cortical region. So the center of the kidney, meaning down into the medullary area.
So in that little zoomed in, since it's in like the inferior portion of the kidney, that would actually be flipped upside down?
What do you mean? This isn't, so, sorry, this circle up here is not zooming in on here.
Oh.
No, it's just saying that these two together, the red and the blue lines, are your interlobular arteries.
No, not that circle, the little white square at the
Which
very
one?
bottom.
Oh, this down here.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, so
Okay.
because it's sitting on the bottom, yes. So basically take that bottom picture and flip it upside down so that this portion here at the tip of your loop of Henle, which I don't know if it's going to let me write on it. This portion down here, which is not letting me do it. Okay, so here, this region here. This part here is actually at the top of that box. And the bottom of that box would be the top portion up here because the outermost region is your cortical region.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Okay. So, we just mentioned that we had in series our two different types of capillary beds. Why do you think it's necessary to have them in series and have them in this particular order? One of them being at a high pressure, one of them being at a low pressure. The high pressure is coming first, the low pressure is coming second. Why does that matter? Okay. All right, very good. So I see a lot of common themes, mainly addressing what we're going to start talking about next, which has to do with your filtration versus your reabsorption. So, your blood coming in through the renal artery is going to pass through and divest off into various afferent arterioles to make sure that it's going to service every single glomerulus that you have in your kidney, which means you have about 1 million of these afferent arterioles because each one is going to service a single glomerular capillary. So, if your blood is under relatively high pressure, which type of force is that going to translate to in the capillary bed in terms of your hydrostatic or colloid osmotic? It's hydrostatic, right? So it's a hydrostatic pressure. So you'll have a comparatively higher hydrostatic pressure entering into your glomerular capillaries. Normally, what would that do to fluid? Would it tend to push it out or bring it in? To push it out. So it tends to, it's one of the forces that's going to try and filter fluid out of the blood. That's what we want. The whole purpose is that we're going to filter our fluid and our nutrients and our small molecules into Bowman space so that it can be processed by the nephron, and then we can reabsorb whatever we need to reabsorb later on. After coming out of the glomerular capillary bed, then that blood is entering into your efferent arteriole. That efferent arteriole is similar to your afferent arteriole in terms of the fact that it can still be regulated very tightly to control the radius. It functions as an arteriole, not a venule. Why do we need to have arteriolar, ability to modulate radius, control, over the efferent side?
So you can shrink it without actually like collapsing it?
So yeah, so you have the same degree of control. Venules can have a modicum of control, but they have discontinuous vascular smooth muscle cells. So remember when we talked about the microvasculature? So they don't have the same ability as an arteriole, which is completely surrounded by a ring of vascular smooth muscle. It has a great degree of control over what the radius is going to be. And by controlling the efferent side, what happens if you constrict the efferent side?
You can increase filtration.
You can actually increase filtration. Why? Because you're slowing down the rate at which that fluid's going to be able to leave. So it might still be coming in at a certain rate, but if you slow down its rate of leaving, you're going to elevate the hydrostatic pressure. You're creating a backup. It was the same thing that we talked about if you were to have that post-capillary resistance go up. Okay, so we have 2 resistors, 2 capillary beds. Now, because you're passing through 2 major resistance vessels before you get to those peritubular capillaries, what is the hydrostatic pressure likely to be when you get over there? It's going to be a little bit lower. What about the colloid osmotic? It's going to be higher. Why? Say again? Because you filtered, you just filtered out a whole bunch of fluid, right? In the glomerular capillary bed, you filtered out fluid. You basically concentrated all of those proteins and cellular components inside of your blood. So your colloid osmotic is going to be higher. Your hydrostatic is going to be comparatively lower, which means what's going to happen in the peritubular capillaries? Reabsorption. Okay? So the benefit of this is having a relatively high pressure capillary bed at the initial point to filter everything out. Then the capillary bed that's going to service the rest of the nephron is there with forces that will promote fluid and solute reabsorption. Okay, so that whatever's filtered doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to lose all of that. You have the opportunity to reabsorb it, and you have the opportunity to reabsorb a lot of fluid. Why do we need to be able to reabsorb a large chunk of the fluid that we filter? What happens if we didn't? You'd be constantly chugging water, okay? Because you'd be losing a lot of your fluid. We have a glomerular filtration rate that is about 125 mils per minute, or 180 liters per day, gets filtered by the glomeruli in your kidneys. The purpose of that is to make sure that every part of your extracellular plasma fluid is basically exposed to a nephron for processing, to make sure that everything is adequately maintaining its normal level of osmolarity as well as concentrations. Okay, so we get to that after, this is mostly organization of the renal system, the next one is going to be GFR. So we'll start talking a lot about the importance of this property. Okay, so our cortical versus our medullary regions are going to help us to identify different types of nephrons. We have a cortical nephron, which most of it is going to reside up in the cortical region. You see all of the capillary beds, all of the convoluted tubules reside up here, as well as your glomerulus. It's part of the main reason why you have such a large granular appearance. It's about 85% of all of the nephrons in your body are cortical nephrons. Okay, so some of it will dip down into the outer medullary region, but it's not going to go further down beyond that. So if 85% are your cortical nephrons, you're only left with about 15% that are your juxtamedullary nephrons. Those are the ones that are on the right-hand side that will show all of your convoluted tubules, proximal and distal, as well as your glomerulus and Bowman's space, Bowman's capsule, residing at the junction of the cortex and the medulla. So when I said all of your glomeruli are in the cortical region, they are. But for your juxtamedullary nephrons, they are at that transition point. But they have comparatively longer loop of Henle, and it delves way down into the inner portion of the medulla. It's only 15% of all the nephrons that make up your kidneys, but they have a really important key role in being able to produce highly concentrated urine. So when you mix that highly concentrated urine with the normal processing urine that you find in cortical regions, you can greatly regulate the osmolarity of the urine that's being produced. Okay? So to look at it from our little guy here, basically what we're looking at is all of these dots are your glomerulus, your glomeruli. This shows the capillary beds, and it's surrounded by Bowman's space, which will dump into your proximal convoluted tubule and your straight tubule, into your loop of Henle, and then coming up through the thick ascending limb, your distal convoluted tubule, your connecting tubule, and then your collecting tubule. And you'll have your outer collecting medullary collecting duct, your inner medullary collecting duct, and you'll see that your cortical and your juxtamedullary can feed into the same medullary collecting duct. For the medullary side, all of your cortical regions are residing a little bit further, closer toward the medullary region, and your loop of Henle is longer and delves further down into the tip, inside of the inner portion of the medulla. Okay, so this is going to be responsible for most of the production of your highly concentrated urine, and they are also fed by a special subset of paratubular capillaries. Paratubular capillaries refer to all capillaries that are feeding the tubular portion of your nephron. But there's a unique term for the ones that run parallel to your juxtamedullary nephron. They're called the vasorecta. And they are ones that are going to be really important in producing highly concentrated or highly dilute urine. Okay, so if 85% of your nephrons are cortical nephrons, and all of your juxtamedullary nephrons also have their glomeruli going into the cortical region. That means that 90% of all blood flow goes into the cortical region. Most of that blood flow is going to enter into those superficial or cortical nephrons. Okay, so 85% is the rough estimate of how many of those nephrons you will have inside of the kidney, but 90% of the blood goes to those nephrons. They do the bulk of the legwork. only about 10% of the blood is going to feed those juxtamedullary nephrons because they are just there for that unique role of producing concentrated urine. Okay? So your cortical nephrons do most of the work. All right. How are we so far? Good? Okay. Now, I've shown several different figures coming from different sources, but one thing that I wanted to compare was that this, I believe, was from the Guyton book, and this one is from the Boron book, okay? So there's a lot more detail that you'll see in the Boron book in terms of all the different parts that are labeled. I like the Boron book because it has a little bit more of the molecular details that we're going to cover, but there is a lot of stuff that's covered in the Guyton book as well. It goes into just about as much depth. So you'll get most of the same kind of information from both. But like I said, my default would say the Boron book is usually a little bit better in terms of the amount of material. So, starting here, we're going to start off with our glomerular capillary bed. Anything that is going to be filtered will enter into Bowman space. And because we're talking about the movement of fluid and solutes coming from blood vessels, the only forces that we're concerned with are your hydrostatic and colloid-osmotic forces. Okay? Same thing that we talked about in microcirculation from the cardiovascular unit. Once everything is filtered out of the glomerular capillaries and enters into Bowman space, it is now contiguous with the tubule. At this point, it is called filtrate. Whatever is filtered at that point is now the tubular filtrate that is going to pass through your entire nephron system. Anything that's left over after it's been processed by all the segments is what gets excreted from the body. From here, we will go into the proximal convoluted tubule, and then that will turn into the proximal straight tubule, and down into the descending limb of the loop of Henle, the thin ascending limb of the loop of Henle, the thicker ascending limb. The thin and thick ascending limbs of the loop of Henle do actually have different functions, and we will talk about those. Okay? The thin ascending limb does have a function that isn't often given the credit that it deserves. Most people focus a lot on the thick ascending limb because that's the major site of diuretics that we'll talk about, and the processing of a lot of solutes. But the thin ascending limb does have an important role in generating the normal gradients that you find in the medulla, which again, we'll discuss a little bit later. From there, we'll come up into your distal convoluted tubule. Now, what do you notice about the location here of your distal convoluted tubule? It's really, really close to your glomerulus. It goes right in between your afferent and efferent arterioles. This is going to be really, really important in terms of autoregulation and tubuloglomerular feedback inside the kidney. The kidney has the ability to change its filtration rate, to increase or decrease filtration rate based on the contents of the tubular fluid at the distal tubule. And it does that because it passes right up next to those two important blood vessels that are going to feed the glomerulus and ultimately regulate the rate at which GFR is occurring. Okay? So that's called the macular densa, which of course we will talk about at length. That will connect to a connecting tubule, and then you will have your cortical collecting tubule, which will, once you pass into the medullary area, you have your outer and inner medullary collecting tubule, and then into your collecting duct. So this shows you on the right-hand side, you have your superficial or cortical nephron. On the left-hand side, you have your juxtamedullary nephron, and you see that they're both going to dump into the collecting duct. So this just gives you a little bit more of some of that detail, but it's color-coded, so it makes it a little easier to see just how short your straight part of your proximal tubule or proximal straight tubule is on your juxtamedullary compared to your cortical nephron. Okay, and the same thing with the length of your juxtamedullary distal tubule compared to the convoluted tubule in your cortical nephrons. So the length of them are a little bit different because the function of them is a little bit different. They all are going to have the same kind of cells. There will just be more of them and more of a gradient that your juxtamedullary nephrons are going to be subject to. based on where the loop of Henle goes. How are we doing? Okay. All right. So now we're back to part 3 of our little model here. This is going to fall, so that's a whole bit. What we're looking at here is we have our afferent, arterial, and our glomerular capillary bed going out through the efferent side. What is this? That's the distal convoluted tubule. This is part of your nephron. So inside here is your filtrate. This is going to be your Bowman's capsule, Bowman's space that's going to surround your glomerular capillary beds, and this is leading into your proximal convoluted tubule and the beginning of your processing. Okay? But this is the distal convoluted tubule that passes right in between these two sites. Okay? That macula densa is going to be responsible for telling us what the content is of the filtrate at that distal region, which says to the kidney that we either need to increase or decrease the rate at which filtration is occurring. All right, now, this is your renal corpuscle. This figure here is just zooming in on that guy. Most of this stuff we've already sort of seen. We've already talked about how you have your glomeruli that are going to come into contact with Bowman's space, but we haven't talked specifically about the membranes that are involved in that filtration process and how we make sure that the stuff we want to get in there is the only stuff that does get in there. Before we do that, though, I do want to point out a couple of quick parts here. We have what's called your mesangial cells that are present in between your afferent and efferent arterioles. This is your efferent side, this is your afferent side. In between there, you have these mesangial cells, which are modified smooth muscle cells. They can have a role in helping to regulate the diameter of your blood vessels. Your arteriolar diameter is going to have a big role in determining the rate at which filtration is going to occur at the glomerulus. This whole area here is called your juxtaglomerular apparatus, and it's going to involve the communication between the macula densa cells that are inside of the distal convoluted tubule that we just saw in that other model, right next to your afferent, which has a larger concentration of those granular juxtaglomerular cells. There are some that are present on your efferent arteriole, but your juxtaglomerular cells are going to be responsible for making, storing, and secreting renin. Okay, renin as in the initiating point of your renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, which we'll get to, I want to say in lecture 21, we'll have a couple of figures that'll walk through everything there. But this is where that will be released from. Okay, renin is going to be produced and stored, and whenever there is a signal coming from the macular densa region that not only can change the release, the diameter of your afferent arteriole and efferent arteriole, but it also can trigger the release of renin in order to promote reabsorption. If renin gets released, usually that's what's the precipitating factor? What's triggering that release? Anybody know? If it's renin, angiotensin, aldosterone, what does aldosterone usually do? Does it promote the reabsorption or the secretion of sodium? Reabsorption. If you're reabsorbing sodium, what else are you reabsorbing? Water. Okay? So what would be something that would trigger you wanting to add more water to the blood? Drop in blood pressure. Okay? So if you have a drop in blood pressure and the content of your sodium chloride at the distal tubule turns out that it is not sufficient, what happens is you get this feedback mechanism that not only will help to regulate the GFR, but it will also cause renin to be released to promote the kidneys to process the electrolytes and your fluid in a way to restore your cardiovascular problem. Okay, so when we started talking about hemodynamics, Remember how I said that all this hemodynamic stuff was going to become really important when we get to the kidneys? It's not just the microvasculature. It's talking specifically about the relationship between blood flow and blood pressure and how the kidneys respond to that and how they're able to help the body maintain fluid levels and therefore volume and pressure levels. Okay, so we will talk a lot more about this whole system. But the region here is called your juxtaglomerular apparatus, and it involves your juxtaglomerular cells that are your renin repositories. It involves the communication between the distal convoluted tubule macula densa and the afferent and efferent arterioles. The mesangial cells will help with controlling that diameter. Okay? All of the smooth muscle cells that are around there, including the mesangial cells, are going to be subject to sympathetic and parasympathetic innervation, as well as different types of chemical mediators that can help relax or cause constriction in the smooth muscle. So things like nitric oxide will help to promote relaxation, carbon dioxide, low pH, all of these things can help to cause relaxation of those smooth muscles. All right, so how do we feel so far? Pretty good? Everything is going to continue to build on this. So if there's anything that's unclear, ask me now so that when I start using this later, it doesn't get more confusing. All right. Very quickly, let me go back for just a second. We are going to look at this region here. You see all those little finger-like projections? Those are called podocytes. Yes?
I have a dumb question, but is it the juxtaglomerular apparatus in the cortical nephron as well? It doesn't
Yes.
change its
Yes.
name? Okay.
No, it is.
So all this is the same.
This is the
regardless of
same,
type
yes.
of-
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yes. So next up, we're going to look at this region. Specifically, the purple dots that's the nuclei, that's your cell body of these podocyte epithelial cells. These are the cells that are inside of your Bowman's capsule. These are your epithelial cells that are going to allow for the processing of fluids. So what we end up having here is we have a few different layers. And I think I might have to write for this one. I hope my pen is charged. Okay, so let's start with our fenestrations. These fenestrations are going to be fairly wide, like 70 nanometers. That's a pretty decent size. You can even get some small proteins out of that. All right, so the fenestrations that are found in your glomerular capillaries are designed to allow solutes and fluid to filter out. The only thing it doesn't filter are very, very large proteins, so your albumin shouldn't get all the way through this whole apparatus. Your cells certainly aren't going to get through here, but it is designed to filter a lot more than actually gets into Bowman space, okay? Because it's sort of your first checkpoint. Those fenestrations allow for fluid and solutes to pass into this gray region, which is your basement membrane, and that's here. Now, your basement membrane actually has 3 different parts, and I am not sure how well I will be able to write that on here, but I'm going to set this down and see if I can do a decent job. All right, so you have your lamina rara externa. Okay? Then you have lamina rara interna. I don't know why Top Hat doesn't like me to write very well. These are sort of the cookie part of your Oreo. Okay? They are going to be on the outermost side. The interna is going to be the part that is on this side, the contact with the blood cell portion, the endothelial side. Okay? So from there, the externa is the part that's going to be over here. It's the side that is in contact with the outside of your body, the epithelial side. Okay, so when we talk about endothelial and epithelial, endo meaning internal, inside your body, epi meaning outside, but you are actually lining the entire tubular region of your nephrons with epithelial cells. Why? Because technically they are contiguous with the outside of your body, right? It's basically the last cell that is going to be in contact with that filtrate, and that filtrate ultimately will leave the body, okay? So they are epithelials technically outside of your body. Now, in between these two, you have the lamina densa. The lamina densa is in between. It's the central region that is right in the middle. It's sort of this darker region that would be inside. Okay? And that would be this guy. Now, they're going to have different roles. Your lamina rara, interna and externa, are blocking molecules from moving through that basement membrane based on charge. They have a relatively high level of negatively charged molecules, including heparin sulfate, that means that they will reject negatively charged or large negatively charged anions that are coming through. The lamina densa blocks things based on size. Okay, so your basement membrane, even though technically it's a membrane, it's not really a cell itself, it is composed of 3 different parts. Now, it's sort of like, I don't know, this might be dating myself, but how many people actually used to have cameras where you got negatives? Okay, I'm not that old. All right, so when you got those, the colors were switched, right? Anything that was light was dark, anything that was dark was light. So it would be like flipping your Oreo backwards, because the internal region is very dark, the outside is a little lighter, okay? The lamina densa is a darker region. It filters things based on overall size. So we're talking relatively small sizes here, 15 nanometers, so we went from like 70 down to about 15, 8 to 15 nanometers for that central region. So the purpose of your basement membrane is to make sure that of all the stuff that gets through those fenestrations, very large, negatively charged molecules are not going to make it past that basement membrane. All right, how do we feel so far? Are you good? Can you read that okay? Okay. All right, so next up, we have our podocytes and our slit diaphragm. So this tiny little slit diaphragm is a little gray line on this figure. And in just a little bit, we're going to get an image from a paper that shows you just how complicated that actually is. But all of those darker yellow parts are those podocytes. It's the foot processes of those epithelial cells that are in direct contact with that basement membrane. So the basement membrane physically joins your endothelial cells from your glomerulus with the podocytes of your epithelial cells from Bowman space. Okay? This is what is going to allow for direct communication between what's in the plasma and what ends up becoming part of the filtrate. But in order to get through this slit diaphragm, there are a number of different proteins that those molecules are going to have to pass through. Anything that is too large or too negatively charged is not going to make it all the way through. This is going to be really important specifically for our larger molecules like our proteins, which should not show up in your filtrate. Okay? So this figure is actually from the Boron book, and it just shows an electron micrograph of the fenestrations that you would see on the glomerular capillaries. But going back into what we would look at for our renal corpuscle, and then if you kind of zoomed in on that, you can see these holes are your fenestrations, and this is actually what the podocytes look like. Those processes of that epithelial cell, they do actually look like that. And that drawing came directly from an electron micrograph. So it is it's kind of neat, because this is the cell body, and it sends all of these projections all over the basement membrane and glomerular capillaries in order to make sure that those slit diaphragms to control the movement of fluid and solutes and proteins are covering every inch of that glomerular capillary bed. Okay? So, this is really going to help make sure that nothing larger than your small nutrients, small byproducts, waste products are going to be passing through. This area right here, that is your slit diaphragm. So it encompasses this whole area. Okay? These proteins are all going to be involved. You don't have to memorize all of these. I'm only going to ask you to look at one. And it's this guy. Nephrin. There is a genetic disease that is common among people of Finnish descent that is a loss of nephrin. And if you lose nephrin, you end up with an abundance of protein showing up in the urine. It's called Finnish type nephrosis, and it's a genetic condition. So your slit diaphragm is going to be really critical in making sure that anything that does get past those first 4 barriers, through that fenestration and through all 3 layers of your basement membrane, this is kind of a last-ditch effort to make sure it doesn't end up in the filtrate. And if you mess with something here, you can end up with stuff going into the kidneys that should not normally be there. Okay? Now, stuff that normally gets filtered. Anything from below about 5.5 kilodaltons is freely going to be filtered. That's small enough to get through everything relatively easily. Anything from 5.5 to about 69 kilodaltons is going to just be filtered a little bit more slowly, but it can still get through. Anything 69 kilodaltons and bigger is not going to get filtered. Okay, that's the size of your albumin. So anything from that size on is not going to be able to show up in the filtrate. Oops. All right, so looking back at our tubule, we have a few different types of cells. One of the things that you will notice specifically about the proximal and the distal convoluted tubule is the abundance of mitochondria. The reason for the abundance of mitochondria is really because these 2 areas are going to be responsible for moving a lot of solutes. And if they're going to move a lot of solutes, mainly the biggest one that's going to help move everything else is going to be sodium. And sodium only works as a secondary active transporter as long as there's a gradient for sodium to want to move into the cell. How are you going to maintain that gradient? Sodium potassium pump. And how does that work? ATP. And how do we get lots of ATP? Lots of mitochondria. Okay? So you get about 20% of all of your blood flow going to the kidneys, and you get about 20% or so of all of your ATP needs come from the kidneys, mainly to fuel all of these active transporters or maintain the gradient that helps to fuel these active transporters. Okay? Sodium, we're going to see when we get to lecture 19, where it talks about how everything is going to be reabsorbed and secreted. Sodium plays a massive role in being able to move these solutes. So we need to have plenty of ATP to make sure that all of this will continue to function normally. We also will talk a little bit about the difference between principal and intercalated cells when we get to the collecting duct region. Again, that will come into lecture 19. But we will talk about the difference in each of those because they have very unique functions in the regulation of absorption of nutrients. All right, what I want to point out here is a kind of a quick and dirty introduction to a few diuretics. A few diuretics that are going to come up multiple times as we go through the renal unit. Acetazolamide we already talked about a little bit. Does anybody remember what that does? Okay, molecularly, what does it do? We're not talking about changing the color of your urine. Yes, a lot of drugs will do that to you. It's kind of like food coloring for the body. What does acetazolamide do inside the body? What's its job? How does it produce diuresis? Oh, we talked about that. We talked about it at the very end. Specifically, we were talking about climbing.
It inhibits carbonic anhydrase.
It inhibits carbonic anhydrase. So why do we care about that? When you climb up to high elevations, your oxygen tension is low in the air, you tend to hyperventilate, which means your pH goes up. So what do? You excrete more bicarb. You excrete a more alkaline urine to get rid of bicarb from the body to make sure that the pH of your body goes back down. So acetazolamide does that by blocking carbonic anhydrase. Okay, it specifically blocks carbonic anhydrase 4, which we'll get to later on. But as a quick introduction, it functions in the proximal convoluted tubule. And by blocking carbonic anhydrase, what it does is it makes sure that more bicarb stays in the tubular fluid and ends up not only being excreted from the body, but also holding on to more water. So it produces diuresis as well. Next up, this is everybody's friend. You've probably heard about this in terms of Lasix. LASIX, that's the common brand name, but furosemide functions on your thick ascending limb of the loop of Henle. It is one of the strongest diuretics that we have. It's an oral medication. It works really, really well. It's a commonly prescribed drug for people undergoing congestive heart failure, right? If you have congestive heart failure, you end up with a lot of edema showing up in the body. One of the ways you can get rid of that excess fluid, furosemide. Furosemide will act by blocking your sodium-potassium 2-chloride cotransporter. I will reiterate that when we get to that in these later units, but as an introduction, it does a really good job of blocking the reabsorption of 3 major ions. If they're stuck inside the tubule, they keep water with them. Amiloride and your thiazide diuretics, those are both going to act on the more distal part, in your distal tubule. The thiazide diuretics, which is not written here, is something that's going to block a sodium and chloride cotransporter. But the neat part about amiloride is it's called a potassium-sparing diuretic. And the way that it works is it directly functions epithelial sodium channels. It blocks those channels to stop sodium from being taken up, and therefore it also blocks the secretion and excess secretion in distal parts of potassium into the tubule for excretion from the body. So it's something that doesn't promote potassium loss. A lot of diuretics will actually promote potassium loss because of the way that they function. How do you think that that would impact the body if you lost potassium because you were trying to control fluid? You're going to have heart challenges, right? Lots of heart problems if you end up losing a lot of potassium from the body, right? You get hypokalemia. That will have a big impact. When we get to lecture 21, we'll talk a lot about how potassium is shifted between intracellular and extracellular environments. But amiloride is used for somebody who might already have a problem with potassium and allows them to still be given a diuretic without losing excess amounts of potassium from the body. All right, how are we doing on time? Oh, good, got lots of time. I know you're excited. We'll finish this and we'll get probably into the GFR one, which is good because that's kind of a long one. For all of the fluid, all of the ions, anything that is going to pass through your kidneys is all coming in from arterial input. So the renal artery is bringing everything to the kidney, but it has 2 different ways of getting out. It can either go out through the renal vein, or you can excrete from the body through the urethra. So anything that's coming in is equal to whatever is leaving in the blood to go back to the circulation, or whatever is being excreted from the body. This is something that's referred to as your clearance. Clearance is going to be really important when we start talking about overall kidney function. Renal clearance is calculated by the concentration of whatever the molecule is. That concentration is going to be equal to whatever the concentration is in the urine times the urine flow rate divided by the concentration, or the concentration that you're going to find in the artery. It's the plasma concentration. So in this case, your clearance of X is going to be your urine concentration times your flow rate divided by your plasma concentration. This is how it's denoted in the boron book. So it's a little different than how we would normally write it. So I'm going to write that over here. This would be clearance is the same thing as in the urine times, you can think of it as flow of the urine divided by X in the plasma. Okay, but if you see this equation, that's how it shows up in the boron book. So, by definition, the clearance of a particular compound, molecule, ion refers to the volume of plasma that is completely cleared of that molecule per unit time. Okay, so when you're looking at the clearance rate, which concentration of plasma are we going to use? Artery or vein? Are we going to use one or the other? Are we going to use both? What do you think? No brave souls today. It's okay. We're going to use the artery because, by definition, there shouldn't be anything in that particular volume of plasma in the venous side because you've completely removed it from that volume of plasma per unit time. Clearance rate is sort of an imaginary volume. It's an imaginary amount. How much of your plasma can you completely remove this X solute from per unit time? That's the value that you're going to calculate. So the concentration of your plasma in the renal vein should be 0 for this particular clearance volume. So we're looking at how much is showing up in the urine, what is the urine flow rate, divided by how much you started with, because your vein should be 0. Rho aminohipurate or hippuric acid, depending on who you talk to, is completely cleared by the kidney on a single pass-through. So any PAH that would enter into your nephron will be completely removed by the time it gets out to the venous region, the vagal region. So any concentration of PAH coming in through the renal artery, all of it should end up in the urine, none of it should end up in the renal vein. Yeah?
In this equation, is clearance the same as glomerular flow rate?
Good question. I'm getting to that in just a second, actually. It can be. It can be the same as GFR, provided that the way that the particular molecule you're looking at is processed. Okay? And that leads into the next part here, which is you have a few different ways that you can process stuff that comes in that's filtered. So whatever it is needs to be freely filtered. And then you can have it be reabsorbed in the tubule, you can have it be secreted in the tubule, and then it eventually will be excreted. So at the end of the day, what you end up with is taking a look at, the excretion rate is really looking at how much is filtered minus how much is reabsorbed back into the body, plus whatever you happen to secrete in there. Not every single molecule or ion is going to be reabsorbed and secreted. Some of them aren't going to have either one done. If that's the case, then your clearance will equal your GFR. So, filtration. You're looking at that should be, well, I'll change this. That should be renal plasma flow. Sorry, I don't know why I wrote RNP. Filtration is relatively variable. About 20% of all the renal plasma flow is going to be filtered. The reabsorption, now I have to write it on every slide. Reabsorption is something that is very selective. what is a molecule that you can think of that is pretty small, that is likely to be freely filtered, but should be completely reabsorbed? Glucose. We do not want any glucose showing up in the urine. If you have a lot of glucose in your blood, and you have a lot of it showing up in your urine, then you have a problem with glucose processing, okay? So, most of your electrolytes, most of your nutritional substances are going to be completely reabsorbed so that you don't lose them from the body. Otherwise, we would be constantly eating and drinking. Most of the waste products are not going to be reabsorbed. We don't want them in our body. The whole purpose is to get them out. Secretion is something that is also going to be highly variable, and it's going to be based on the type of molecule that we're talking about, and we're also going to look specifically at the rates based on concentration differences. But it will be very important for getting rid of toxins for any kind of drug products. For PAH, that's not something that's in your body. That's something that's used in order to determine the clearance to figure out how fast your plasma flow is moving. Okay? These three parameters are going to be applicable to every type of molecule that goes through your kidneys. The question is, which ones are actually being utilized? So, you can have something that is filtered and nothing else. So, a certain amount of it gets filtered, and then whatever doesn't get filtered goes out through the renal vein. This is an example of a molecule that would function to use as a way to calculate GFR. By calculating clearance of something that is filtered, it's not metabolized by the kidney, it's not produced by the kidney, and it's not reabsorbed or secreted in the tubule. The clearance of that means it's the same as the glomerular filtration rate, because the only source of that molecule in the urine came from filtration. There was no other way to get it in there. You can have something that is filtered and partially reabsorbed. Not completely reabsorbed, so you'll still see some of it showing up in the urine. You can have something that's filtered and completely reabsorbed. So something that's partially reabsorbed, you might still have some electrolytes that show up in your urine. You will have something that's completely reabsorbed, and glucose is a great example of that. That should be completely reabsorbed. You should not have any of that showing up in the urine. You also can have something that is filtered and then secreted. So whatever's filtered gives you kind of a baseline that's processed earlier in the proximal tubule, but then later on, you have the ability to add the rest of that, which is what happens in PAH, into the tubule. So whatever doesn't get filtered can get secreted. PAH is a good example because that will help you to determine the overall renal plasma flow if you use that to calculate your clearance. We're going to talk about clearance. We'll talk about calculating GFR and calculating renal plasma flow. This is just our introduction to it so that it's familiar when we get to it. Secretion can also happen of waste products. So urea is a good example of something that is going to be reabsorbed and will be secreted. And you're going to see that that's going to have a big role specifically in creating a concentration gradient that helps to produce highly concentrated urine for those juxtamedullary nephrons. But this is what he was mentioning before. Your clearance of X can equal GFR only if this occurs and this does not. Okay? And again, the assumption is that your kidney cells are not producing whatever it is that you're looking at. It's not going to break it down. It's not going to metabolize it. It's not going to synthesize it. The only source of that compound in the urine came from filtration. So the rate at which it shows up in the urine is the same as the rate at which filtration occurs. Okay? How are we doing? Because that's the end of this one. I'm going on to the next one. No questions? All right. All right, let's go fun begin. Now we're going to start talking about GFR. Which is why I made that available ahead of time. Because I figured we'd probably get into a little bit of this today. All right, so filtration, as we said before, these are your Starling forces. These are going to be hydrostatic, colloidosmotic, or oncotic pressure. So that's the pressure exerted by any of your solutes. Proteins are going to have a big role in that, and it's going to make a big difference in determining which direction you're going to have fluid moving. About 180 liters per day is what your typical glomerular filtration rate is. That equates to about 125 mils per minute. The turnover is very high to make sure that you do not have an accumulation of toxins or any kind of harmful chemicals, and that you don't end up with an imbalance of stuff inside of your body. Your kidneys' job is really, really important. If you are under stressful situations or hemorrhagic situations, the 3 parts of your body that are absolutely critical to make sure that you continue to perfuse: brain, heart, kidneys. So, what's filtered? Inulin has a molecular weight of about 5.5 kilodaltons. That's something that is freely filtered. It is also something that is not going to be reabsorbed and is not going to be secreted. So, calculating the clearance of inulin can tell you what? GFR, glomerular filtration rate. Okay, so if you calculate the clearance of inulin, you can get your GFR rate. Albumin is sort of the top end of that value. 69 kilodaltons will give you the maximum point at which anything above that can't be filtered, no matter how slowly it'll occur. Okay, so you should never have albumin showing up in the kidneys. You do have a lot of other molecules in your body that fit within these sizes. Anything less than 69 kilodaltons can be freely filtered, but you don't necessarily see it showing up inside of your filtrate. Why?
Repeat the question.
So if you have other molecules in your body, hemoglobin, myoglobin, if you have other things inside your body that are technically capable of being filtered, why aren't they?
Negative charge.
So that could be a negative charge that would help to keep larger ones out. But if it's small enough to be freely filtered, myoglobin is an example that's actually going to show up in this cup. Why don't we see myoglobin showing up, even though technically it's only 17 kilodaltons?
Because it should stay in the muscle.
It should stay in the muscle. You should not have myoglobin circulating in your blood. If you do, there's a problem. Okay? And sometimes the kidneys can tell you when you have a problem somewhere else in your body because something that's showing up inside of your urine should not be there. Okay? So I have a little clip that will walk through an example of this specifically relating to how myoglobin can show up. Some of you might have seen this already.
What'd you call that? It's tea-colored, right? The guy we thought was just after the drugs. What's the differential diagnosis for urine that's tea-colored?
Kidney stone.
Kidney stones would cause what?
Blood and urine.
What color is your pee?
Yellow.
What color is your blood?
Red.
What colors did I use?
Red, yellow, and brown.
And brown. What causes brown?
Waste.
Which means the kidneys are shutting down. Why?
Trauma.
Now that his history would indicate.
Could be damage done by the self-injection of the Demerol.
Treatment?
Heat and rest.
Other possible causes.
Infection.
Starting on antibiotics. What else? Come on, come on!
I don't know.
You're useless. But at least you know it. Blood test show elevated creatine kinase. What does that tell you?
The trauma diagnosis is right. If he takes it easy for a few days, he'll be fine.
You sure?
The elevated CK rules out
You
infection.
know what's worse than useless? Useless and oblivious. What are they missing?
You know, it's kind of hard to think when you're in our face like that.
Yeah, you think it's going to be easier when you got a real patient really dying? What are you missing?
Muscle death.
Not your case.
Nothing wrong with the consult. Dying muscle leaks myoglobin. It's toxic to the kidneys.
Brilliant. MRI his leg, see what's killing him.
Alright, so, not the kindest instructor, but effective. So, myoglobin showing up in the kidneys. Why is it toxic to the kidneys? Myoglobin binds oxygen. It's very important for being able to store oxygen in your muscles. Hemoglobin also binds oxygen. We talked more about the hemoglobin structure. What do you have that's a big part of hemoglobin that's the reason why oxygen can bind? Iron, okay? So what happens with myoglobin is it's small enough to be freely filtered. It shouldn't filter because it shouldn't be in your blood. If it's in your blood, it will go into the kidneys. It will be filtered. The problem is the low pH inside of your urine will cause it to dissociate. And you'll get globin and you'll get a ferriheme. And that can cause obstruction of the tubules, and that obstruction actually kills your tubular cells as well as killing your kidneys in general. It ruins the overall function of your kidney. So just because something can get through doesn't mean it should get through, okay? Most of the reasons that we have these kinds of restrictions are because of the stuff that's normally found in your blood. So the kidneys, your urine output, color, and content can be used to give you very important information about how the rest of your body is functioning, not just how your kidneys themselves are functioning. So we have about 2 minutes left, but I'm going to stop right there before we get into GFR heavily, and we will finish this on, oh gosh, what day is it? Tuesday? Thursday. We'll finish on Thursday.